They're coming for you tonight. And this time, they mean business. The anonymous letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, containing a single bullet, no signature needed. Ida B. Wells stared at the death threat in her trembling hands, her heart pounding as she realized that in 1892 Memphis, Tennessee, these weren't empty words. They were blood-soaked promises from men who had already proven their willingness to kill. Just weeks earlier, she had published the most dangerous article of her life, exposing truths so explosive and threatening to the white power structure that they would force her to flee the South forever, abandoning everything she had worked to build. If you think you've seen courage in the face of impossible odds, wait until you hear what this woman did completely alone, against an entire system designed to destroy her. If you enjoy stories of forgotten heroes who changed history against all odds, subscribe to the channel now and leave a comment saying remember Ida B. Wells, so her name is never forgotten by history. But let's rewind to understand how a young black woman born into slavery became so threatening to the white supremacist establishment that they wanted her eliminated from existence. 3 months before that chilling death threat, Ida was living what seemed like a relatively safe and prosperous life as a schoolteacher and part-time journalist in Memphis. She had carefully built a circle of trusted friends, owned a significant stake in a thriving newspaper called the Free Speech and Headlight, and enjoyed genuine respect in her community for her sharp intellect, fierce independence, and absolutely fearless writing style that never backed down from controversy. Then came March 9, 1892, the night that would change everything forever and set her on a collision course with the most powerful and violent forces in America. 3 of her closest friends, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart, were illegally dragged from their jail cells by a heavily armed masked mob in the dead of night. What happened next in those dark woods outside Memphis would completely shatter everything Ida believed about justice, law, order, and the possibility of safety for Black Americans in post-Reconstruction America. Their supposed crime, opening the People's Grocery, a successful store that dared to compete directly with established white-owned businesses in the neighborhood. Their real offense, being prosperous, independent Black men who refused to bow down, stay in their assigned place, or accept the economic limitations white society tried to impose. Their punishment, a savage, methodical lynching so utterly brutal in public that it shocked even hardened Memphis residents who thought they had witnessed every possible horror. But here's what made this particular moment fundamentally different from the thousands of other lynchings. Systematically terrorizing Black communities across the South, Ida B. Wells absolutely refused to accept the official story, the convenient lies, or the imposed silence. While everyone else bowed their heads in church and whispered fearful prayers for protection, she picked up her pen like a loaded weapon and made a decision that would change American history. She would investigate this lynching herself, document the truth, and expose the lies, whatever the consequences might be. What Ida discovered in her investigation would destroy everything white America wanted the world to believe about lynching. For decades, the official narrative was simple and seemingly justified. Black men were lynched because they committed terrible crimes, especially against white women. It was rough justice, they claimed, but necessary justice. The South painted these murders as unfortunate but understandable responses to Black criminality and sexual violence. Even many sympathetic whites in the North accepted this explanation, turning a blind eye to the growing epidemic of racial violence, sweeping across the former Confederacy like a plague. But Ida's 3 friends shattered that comfortable lie completely. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart weren't criminals or rapists or murderers. They were successful businessmen whose only crime was economic competition. The People's Grocery had been thriving, drawing customers away from the white-owned Barrett's Grocery across the street. When tensions escalated into a confrontation and shots were fired, the 3 men defended their property, and for that act of self-defense, they were branded as criminals and executed without trial. This revelation hit Ida like a lightning bolt of absolute clarity. If her friends, men she knew personally, Respected community members with families and sterling reputations could be lynched for simply being successful. Then the entire justification for lynching was a monstrous fabrication designed to hide something far more sinister. She began connecting dots that others were too terrified to even acknowledge existed. Armed with her journalist's instincts and absolutely fearless determination, she started researching other lynchings across the South, writing letters to newspaper editors, conducting interviews with survivors' families, and uncovering a pattern that made her blood run cold. In case after case, the victims weren't the monsters white newspapers described. They were men who had become too prosperous, too independent, or too confident for white comfort. Men who had dared to compete successfully with white businesses, who had accumulated too much valuable land, who had spoken up against injustice, or who had simply been in the wrong place when white mobs needed a scapegoat for their economic frustrations. The truth was even more horrifying than she had initially imagined. Lynching wasn't rough justice administered by outraged communities. It was systematic economic terrorism designed specifically to keep Black Americans in economic submission. It was a deliberate, coordinated campaign to steal Black wealth, destroy Black success, and maintain white economic dominance through pure terror. But Ida knew that discovering the truth and surviving long enough to expose it were two very different challenges entirely. Every single day she spent investigating brought her closer to sharing the same fate as her murdered friends. The question that haunted her sleepless nights was simple, but absolutely terrifying. How could one woman challenge an entire system built on lies and maintained through murder? July 16, 1862. Holly Springs, Mississippi. Ida Bell Wells was born into a world that told her she was worth nothing, literally nothing. She entered life as property, not a person. During the height of the Civil War, when her enslaved parents, James and Lizzie Wells, could only pray that freedom might somehow find their newborn daughter. The plantation where Ida took her first breath was a place where Black children learned early that their dreams meant nothing. Their voices counted for nothing, and their lives could be snuffed out without consequence. But something was different about this baby girl from the very beginning. Even as a toddler, Ida displayed a fierce independence that worried and amazed the adults around her. She asked too many questions, challenged too many rules, and showed too much backbone for a child born into bondage. When other children learned to lower their eyes and speak softly, Ida looked people directly in the face and demanded answers. The Civil War ended when Ida was just 3 years old, transforming her from property into a free person overnight. But freedom in Mississippi during Reconstruction was a dangerous illusion. The Wells family moved to town, where James found work as a carpenter and became politically active, while Lizzie took in laundry. They were determined to give their children something that had been denied to them: education. At age 6, Ida walked into Shaw University, later Rust College, a school built specifically for freed slaves. Here, something extraordinary happened. The girl who had been considered worthless property revealed herself to be brilliant beyond anyone's expectations. She devoured books with an insatiable hunger, mastering reading, writing, and arithmetic with stunning speed. Her teachers watched in amazement as this young girl absorbed knowledge like a sponge absorbs water. But Ida's education was about more than books. Her parents taught her something equally valuable and infinitely more dangerous: self. James Wells refused to bow and scrape to white authority, and he passed this defiant spirit to his daughter. He told her that being born Black and female didn't make her inferior to anyone. He taught her that her mind was her weapon and her voice was her power. This lesson would prove both life-saving and life-threatening. In 1878, when Ida was just 16 years old, tragedy struck with devastating force. A yellow fever epidemic swept through Mississippi like the angel of death itself, and within days, both her parents and her infant brother were gone. Suddenly, Ida found herself orphaned, responsible for 5 younger siblings, and facing a choice that would define everything: give up her education to survive, or find a way to do both. Most 16-year-old girls, especially Black girls in 1878 Mississippi, would have had no choice but to surrender their dreams. But Ida wasn't most girls. She made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She would become a teacher, support her family, and continue fighting for the education and dignity that her parents had died believing she deserved. At 16, Ida Wells did something that seemed impossible in 1878 Mississippi. She lied about her age, put on her mother's clothes to look older, and convinced a rural school board to hire her as a teacher. Every Monday morning, she rode a mule 6 miles to a one-room schoolhouse where she taught children who were sometimes only a few years younger than herself. Every Friday, she rode back to town to care for her 5 siblings, managing a household that most adults would have found overwhelming. For 4 years, Ida lived this double life, teacher by week, surrogate mother by weekend. She earned $14 a month, barely enough to keep her family fed and housed, but she was determined that her siblings would never know the hopelessness of ignorance. Education, she believed, was the only path to true freedom. But as she matured from a grieving teenager into a confident young woman, Ida began to understand that teaching children to read wasn't enough. The entire system needed to be challenged. In 1884, at age 22, Ida moved to Memphis, Tennessee, seeking better opportunities and higher pay. Memphis felt like a different world, a bustling river city where Black professionals could build successful lives and where she could finally pursue her own education seriously. She enrolled in Fisk University's summer sessions, hungry to expand her intellectual horizons beyond the basics she had been teaching. But on May 4, 1884, everything changed during what should have been a routine train ride. Ida had purchased a first-class ticket from Memphis to Nashville, as was her right under the law. When she took her seat in the first-class car, the conductor demanded she move to the overcrowded smoking car reserved for Black passengers. The car was dirty, filled with white men drinking and spitting tobacco, and clearly inferior to the accommodations she had paid for. Most Black passengers in 1884 would have quietly moved, understanding that challenging Jim Crow could mean anything from humiliation to violence. But Ida Wells was not most passengers. She looked the conductor dead in the eye and refused to budge. When he tried to physically remove her, she bit his hand and held onto her seat with both hands. It took 3 men to drag her off that train. Instead of slinking away in shame, Ida did something revolutionary. She sued the railroad company. While her community watched in a mixture of admiration and terror, this young Black woman took on the entire segregation system in court. Against all odds, she won. A local court awarded her $500 in damages, a fortune for a school teacher, and newspapers across the country reported the shocking story of a Black woman who had successfully challenged Jim Crow. But the victory was short. The Tennessee Supreme Court overturned the decision, and Ida was forced to pay court costs. More importantly, she learned a harsh lesson about the limits of legal justice in the post-Reconstruction South. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. If she wanted to fight injustice effectively, she would need a different weapon. She would need the power of the pen. Ida Wells picked up her pen in 1889 like a soldier picking up a rifle, understanding instinctively that words could be more dangerous than bullets when aimed at the right targets. She became co-owner and editor of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, a Black newspaper that had been playing it safe, publishing church news and social events while carefully avoiding anything that might anger white authorities. But safety had never been Ida's priority. Truth was. Her first controversial editorial sent shockwaves through Memphis. She dared to criticize the deplorable conditions of Black schools, pointing out that while white children learned in well-equipped buildings with qualified teachers, Black children were crammed into dilapidated shacks with outdated books and underpaid instructors. The Memphis School Board was furious. They fired her from her teaching position immediately, cutting off her steady income and making it clear that challenging the system came with severe consequences. But losing her teaching job only freed Ida to become more dangerous. Without the constraints of employment in the white-controlled education system, she could write whatever truths needed to be told. Her circulation grew rapidly as Black readers across the South discovered a newspaper that finally spoke their reality instead of tiptoeing around white sensibilities. Her articles became increasingly bold and uncompromising. She wrote about voter suppression, economic discrimination, and the daily humiliations of Jim Crow with a clarity and courage that terrified white supremacists. She named names, cited specific examples, and refused to soften her language to make white readers comfortable. Every week, her newspaper became more popular and more dangerous to publish. By 1892, IDA had built the Free Speech into one of the most influential Black newspapers in the South. With readers from Tennessee to Texas, she traveled throughout the region, documenting injustices and building a network of correspondents who fed her stories that other papers were too frightened to print. She was becoming exactly what white supremacists feared most: an independent Black woman with a platform, an audience, and absolutely no fear of speaking truth to power. But it was her investigation into lynching that would transform her from a regional troublemaker into a national threat. She had been documenting these murders for months, noticing patterns that others either couldn't see or were too terrified to acknowledge. Each story revealed the same horrifying truth. The official justifications for lynching were lies designed to hide systematic economic terrorism. Then came March 1892, and the lynching of her 3 friends changed everything. Ida realized she had been documenting individual symptoms of a disease, but she had never diagnosed the disease itself. Now she understood. Lynching wasn't random violence or rough justice, it was a coordinated campaign to destroy Black economic success through terror. She sat down to write the most dangerous editorial of her life, an article that would expose the truth about lynching so clearly and devastatingly that it would force her to flee the South forever. As she dipped her pen in ink, she knew she was writing her own death warrant, but the truth had to be told, regardless of the consequences. The world needed to know what was really happening in the American South, and she was the only one brave enough to tell them. On May 21, 1892, Ida Wells published 8 paragraphs that would change American history forever. Her editorial in the Free Speech was titled simply 8 Men Lynched, but its contents were dynamite, wrapped in newspaper ink. She had spent weeks investigating not just her friends' murders, but lynchings across the South. And what she discovered was so explosive, it would force the entire nation to confront an ugly truth they had been desperately avoiding. The people must know the truth, she wrote, and then she delivered it with surgical precision. She documented case after case where the official story that Black men were lynched for assaulting white women was a complete fabrication. In many instances, she proved, the relationships had been consensual. White women had willingly entered relationships with Black men, only to cry rape when discovered to avoid social disgrace or family shame. But her most devastating revelation went deeper than exposing false rape accusations. Ida demonstrated that lynching was systematic economic warfare disguised as moral outrage. She showed how successful Black businessmen, prosperous farmers, and independent professionals were being murdered under fabricated pretenses, their property seized, their families terrorized into fleeing, their wealth transferred to white hands. Her investigation revealed the cold calculation behind the violence. Lynch mobs weren't spontaneous eruptions of righteous anger, they were organized terrorist operations designed to maintain economic control. She documented how white competitors would orchestrate accusations against successful Black men, knowing that a lynching would eliminate business competition and serve as a warning to other Black entrepreneurs who might dare to prosper. The most dangerous paragraph in her editorial was also the most direct. Nobody in this section of the country believes the old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women. If Southern white men are not careful, they will overreach themselves and public sentiment will have a reaction. A conclusion will then be reached which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. These words were revolutionary and terrifying. Ida had done the unthinkable. She had questioned the honor of white Southern womanhood, the sacred cornerstone of white supremacist ideology. She had suggested that white women were capable of lying about rape and engaging in consensual relationships with black men. In the racial hierarchy of the 1890s South, this was the ultimate blasphemy. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. White newspapers across the South reprinted her editorial with hysterical condemnation. The Memphis Commercial wrote that the fact that a black scoundrel is allowed to live and utter such loathsome and repulsive calumnies is a volume of evidence as to the wonderful patience of Southern whites. Death threats poured in from across the region. But Ida was out of town when her editorial exploded across the South like a powder keg. She was in New York attending a conference, completely unaware that back in Memphis, an armed white mob had surrounded her newspaper office, threatening to burn it down and lynch anyone associated with the publication. Her business partner barely escaped with his life, and the printing press was destroyed. When word reached her in New York that returning to Memphis meant certain death, Ida Wells faced the most agonizing decision of her life: live safely in exile, or return home and almost certainly be murdered for telling the truth. Miss Wells, you cannot go home. They will kill you the moment you step off the train. The telegram from Memphis arrived at Ida's New York hotel room on May 27, 1892, 6 days after her editorial had detonated across the South like a bomb. Her business partner, who had barely escaped Memphis with his life, was blunt. Armed white men were patrolling the train station, waiting for her return. The free speech office had been destroyed, their printing press smashed to pieces, and bounties were being offered for her capture. Standing in that hotel room, reading her own death sentence, Ida faced a choice that would define not just her future, but the future of civil rights in America. She could retreat into silence, find a quiet teaching job in the North, and live safely, as so many other black intellectuals had chosen to do. Or she could turn her forced exile into a platform and fight the system that had tried to silence her with even greater determination. Ida Wells chose war. If the South wanted to exile her for telling the truth about lynching, she would use that exile to tell the truth to the entire world. Within weeks of being driven from Memphis, she had secured a position with the New York Age, the most influential black newspaper in the country, giving her a platform that reached far beyond anything she had possessed in Memphis. Her first major article for the New York Age was a masterpiece of investigative journalism that would establish her as the nation's foremost authority on lynching. Titled Southern Horrors: Lynch Law in All Its Phases, the piece systematically dismantled every justification white America had constructed for racial terrorism. She documented 728 lynchings that had occurred in the previous decade, proving with statistics and witness testimonies that the vast majority had nothing to do with protecting white women or punishing sexual assault. But Ida didn't stop with documentation. She demanded action. She called for economic boycotts of Southern businesses, urging black Americans to use their purchasing power as a weapon against lynching. When she discovered that Memphis streetcar revenues had dropped significantly after black residents began walking rather than riding, she realized she had found a strategy that could actually hurt the people who were hurting her community. Her influence grew rapidly as newspapers across the country began reprinting her articles and editorials. What had started as a local confrontation in Memphis was becoming a national conversation about racial violence, and Ida Wells was driving that conversation with relentless determination and uncompromising facts. But her enemies weren't sitting idle. White supremacist newspapers launched vicious personal attacks against her, questioning her morality, her sanity, and her right to speak for black Americans. They spread lies about her character and offered rewards for information about her whereabouts. Southern politicians denounced her in speeches, and white clergy condemned her from their pulpits. The more they attacked her, the more determined Ida became. She began planning something unprecedented, a fact-finding tours that would take her message beyond America's borders. If white America wouldn't listen to the truth about lynching, perhaps the international community would. She was about to become the first person to expose America's racial terrorism to the world stage, knowing that such exposure might be the only thing powerful enough to force change. In 1893, Ida Wells did something that shocked both her enemies and her allies. She sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to expose America's dirty secret to the British Empire. Armed with photographs of lynching victims, detailed testimonies from survivors, and statistical evidence that no one could dispute, she launched the first international human rights campaign in American history. Her mission was audacious and dangerous: to shame America on the world stage until the violence stopped. Her first speech in Liverpool drew a crowd of over 2,000 people, including members of parliament, influential journalists, and powerful business leaders. Standing before this distinguished British audience, Ida displayed photographs that most Americans had never seen: images of charred bodies hanging from trees, of crowds of white men, women, and children posing cheerfully beside their victims like they were at a county fair. The gasps of horror that filled the auditorium told her everything she needed to know. The world had no idea what was happening in the American South. Every week, somewhere in the southern United States, a black human being is tortured to death, she told the stunned audience, not by savage tribes in some distant jungle, but by American citizens in the shadow of churches and courthouses, while law enforcement officers stand by and watch. The British press exploded with outrage, and suddenly American lynching was front-page news across Europe. The international attention infuriated white American leaders, who found themselves having to defend the indefensible to their international allies and trading partners. Southern politicians who had dismissed Ida as a troublesome woman were now facing uncomfortable questions from British diplomats and European business partners. The economic and diplomatic pressure was unlike anything they had experienced. But Ida's international campaign also created powerful enemies within her own community. Booker T. Washington, the most influential black leader in America, publicly criticized her approach, arguing that confrontational tactics would only make things worse for black Americans. He believed in accommodation and gradual progress, while Ida demanded immediate justice and international intervention. The conflict between Ida and Booker T. Washington became a defining split in black leadership philosophy. Washington commanded enormous resources and had the support of white philanthropists who funded black education and institutions. When he turned against Ida's campaign, many black newspapers and organizations were forced to choose sides, and most chose the safer path of supporting Washington's accommodationist approach. Despite this opposition from her own community, Ida's international pressure campaign was working. British anti-lynching committees formed in major cities, sending letters and petitions to American officials. European newspapers regularly covered American racial violence, damaging America's international reputation. The U.S. State Department was flooded with diplomatic inquiries about lynching, forcing the federal government to acknowledge a problem they had previously ignored. When Ida returned from Britain in 1894, she found an America that could no longer pretend lynching was just a regional issue that would solve itself. The international spotlight she had created was forcing uncomfortable conversations in Congress, in newspapers, and in churches across the nation. But she also discovered that her success had made her more dangerous than ever to the forces she was fighting. The question that haunted her enemies was terrifying in its implications. If one black woman with a pen and a platform could embarrass America on the world stage, what would happen if others followed her example? When Ida B. Wells died in Chicago in 1931, the obituaries in white newspapers were brief and dismissive, treating her as a footnote to history. They had no idea they were burying the woman who had fundamentally changed how the world understood American racial violence. But history has a way of correcting such oversights, and today we recognize Ida Wells as one of the most courageous and effective civil rights leaders America has ever produced. If you've been inspired by Ida's incredible courage and want to discover more stories of forgotten heroes who changed the world, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now and leave a comment saying, "Remember Ida B. Wells," so her fearless legacy is never forgotten by history. Her fearless investigation of lynching didn't just expose individual crimes, it revealed the systematic nature of racial terrorism in America. Before Ida Wells, lynching was dismissed as isolated incidents of rough frontier justice. After her documentation and analysis, the world understood lynching for what it truly was: coordinated economic warfare designed to maintain white supremacy through terror. Her work provided the factual foundation that future civil rights leaders would build upon for generations. The investigative journalism techniques Ida pioneered, traveling to crime scenes, interviewing witnesses, analyzing patterns, and connecting individual incidents to broader systemic issues, became the blueprint for modern civil rights documentation. Organizations like the NAACP, which she helped found in 1909, used her methods to expose and combat racial injustice throughout the 20th century. Her international human rights campaign created a template that would be used repeatedly in future struggles for justice. When civil rights leaders in the 1950s and 1960s sought international support for their cause, they were following the path Ida Wells had carved in the 1890s. Her understanding that domestic oppression could be challenged through international pressure became a cornerstone of modern human rights activism. Perhaps most importantly, Ida Wells proved that one person with courage, facts, and determination could challenge seemingly insurmountable systems of oppression. She demonstrated that truth-telling, even when dangerous, could create change that seemed impossible. Her example inspired generations of journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The statistical impact of her work was measurable and profound. Lynchings in America peaked in the 1890s, the same decade Ida began her campaign. By the 1920s, the numbers had dropped dramatically, partly due to the national and international attention her work had generated. Her documentation made denial impossible and indifference unacceptable. Today, when journalists expose corruption, when activists document police violence, when ordinary citizens use social media to broadcast injustice to the world, they are walking in footsteps that Ida B. Wells carved more than a century ago. They said a black woman couldn't stop lynching, but Ida B. Wells proved that sometimes the most dangerous person in the world is someone who refuses to be silenced, someone who chooses truth over safety, and someone who understands that real change requires real courage.